Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Dangerous Visitor by Minus the Leela. I went on a group camping trip in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, only to awaken one night and hear something sniffing the outside of our tent. My immediate reaction was that it was likely a bear or some animal that came across our site, and just maybe my dumbass friends didn't tie up the garbage. Seconds later, I could hear the sniffing go to the tent next to ours, and everyone in mine grabbed one another quietly to acknowledge we were all awake, and we were all aware of what was going on outside. Moments later, a friend in another tent popped out and started to scream and make noise. He had a gun, too. He was hoping the noise would scare off whatever animal was on our site. Turns out, it wasn't an animal. It was some guy who had gone through our coolers and food and also decided it would be okay to sniff our tents. Our friend chased him off, and we immediately packed our shit and left. A year after that incident, my dumbass friends and I went back to the nearby area, thinking what we encountered was a one-time incident. This time, we thought we'd outsmart any possible creepers, and instead of camping in our tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. 'Cause they can't possibly sniff a Toyota Tacoma, right? Anyway, it was the middle of the night. I was passed out in the back of my SUV when I suddenly felt a bright light on my face. Naturally, I would have woken up, cussed, and asked who was doing that. But however, I instantly knew to pretend to be asleep and not let the individual know I was awake. I lay there next to my girlfriend, hoping she would do the same as I, and I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds, like sniffing. All I could hear was a friend snoring by the campfire. After the light left my car, I heard the person walk to the next truck and shine his light on my friends in there. I slowly looked up, and it ended up being some older guy, just standing there staring at everyone while they slept. I waited until he left the campsite, and then I busted my ass out of that truck and woke up my friends, most of whom had also been pretending to sleep, and realized what was going on. We didn't go back camping to that site ever again. Creepy Backwoods Experiences by Anonymous. For about 2 years, I worked as an instructor at a therapeutic wilderness program in western North Carolina. I was in charge of at-risk youth, and my job included all the responsibilities and nuances associated with that. Shifts ran 16 days straight, on the clock 24/7 of that time, and all spent backpacking. Most of this takes place in Nantahala National Forest, DuPont State Forest, and Panthertown Valley. Here are some of the creepy things that happened to me and my groups out there. Teased by a hillbilly. Without delving too much into programming and wilderness therapy in general, I do have to explain certain aspects of the job, so bear with me. Because none of these kids are voluntarily in the program, some are a flight risk. To minimize the success of potential runaways, staff are required to sleep under an open tarp and between the doors of the tents. Often our setup looked like 2 tents facing under a large A-frame tarp with staff sleeping in between. Another precaution is called the boot line. The kids' boots stay lined up under gear tarp at night. It's hard to run in your camp Crocs. Anyhow, this boot line is visible from underneath the sleeping tarp. So, on this particular night, we were camped in some of the most far-flung areas the program goes to. We simply referred to it as Parkway Expo because our expedition often began with being dropped alongside the Blue Ridge Parkway and hiking into the rugged wilderness that surrounds it. It's a spot called Wet Camp Gap. From the sleeping tarp, I could see the boot line across camp in the direction of my feet, and it was my job to wake up once every 3 hours for silent head count. I woke up from my 3 a.m. check and turned on the red filter on my headlamp. I had a weird feeling. I first scanned the boot line, and something wasn't right. 13 pairs of boots. It took some time to register. Usually when something doesn't feel right, there's a pair or two missing and a kid or two gone. But there were only 12 kids. At the end of the boot line, there was a pair of tall men's hunting boots. Staff boots aren't kept there, and as that dawned on me in my sleepy haze, I snapped to reality, sat up and switched to my white light. It cast light across the camp, and the second the light fell on the hunting boots, the man who had been standing in them the whole time suddenly turned and walked off into the brush. That was a moment of sheer terror as I jumped up after him, but he was long gone by the time I wiggled out of my sleeping bag. The following day we were packing up and making breakfast when a group of 3 men walked through the field we were in. The trail ran right through it, so it wasn't unusual, but they came out of the woods from a strange angle perpendicular to the trail. I was over in the far corner of camp with one co-instructor doing a daily briefing when they entered just a few yards away. They stopped and looked at us. All were armed, and I recognized one of the men's boots immediately. "It gave me a scare last night," I said. None of them spoke. They only stared blankly. "You guys okay? You lost?" Still no response. The situation felt uneasy as they stared at us, their gaze unbroken. "Here," I said, "let me show you on my map." It was already in my hand. I got up from the stump I was sitting on and approached them, and the trio suddenly turned and walked on across the clearing and out of view. I was glad we were moving the opposite way and only had one more night till our pickup and transport to base camp. That final night we were all sound asleep, about 2 a.m. or so. The night was broken by a blood-curdling scream, and it was my female co-instructor. She was frantically running her fingers through her hair and completely inconsolable. I got her away from the group and calmed her down enough so that she could speak, and she says that she woke up to what she assumed was a large spider or a mouse in her hair. But when she turned on her headlamp, she was greeted by the face of the tall-booted hillbilly wearing night vision goggles. He'd gotten almost a full braid in before she woke up and he fled. We never saw any more of them, but she never came back for another shift either, the poor thing. A few weeks later, the local S&R found a woman who'd gone missing nearby. She'd been accosted by a man and tied to a tree and left there. She was found alive something like 4 days later, still bound to the tree. Surrounded in Panthertown. Panthertown Valley is a special hiking and camping area within the larger Nantahala National Forest. This was an entirely different group of kids. We were camped down on the valley floor in a pine forest down from Salt Rock. This stand of trees is particularly creepy simply because it's cold and dark, even on sunny days. But nights are just plain eerie in there. It was getting toward bedtime, 9 p.m. We were gathered around the fire having nightly circle. The quiet evening ritual was broken by a huge crash. It was in the direction of our bear hang where all of our food was suspended from a tree out of reach of bears and raccoons. We all booted up and ran over, and the bags were laying on the ground, but no animals in sight. Had the rope snapped? No, it came untied. I joked at my group's expense about shoddy knot work. We resecured the setup and returned to camp and settled into bed. Around midnight, bam! The bags fell again. Now I was mad. I don't like waking up to rehang food because of something as preventable as a second botched knot. I just woke up the boys, and they swore they tied it right. It didn't matter. We had to rehang it anyway, so everyone booted up and dragged on over. This time I was going to tie the damn knot. I was in mid-lecture with a knot lesson when across the stand of pines the dying fire suddenly went black with a hiss, and our tents disappeared into darkness. It wasn't raining. Someone had doused our fire. We could hear their footsteps, and now some of them behind us. We grabbed the food bags and ran back to the tents, but no one was there. But there were footsteps all around us in the woods, branches being broken off trees everywhere. This went on till at least 4 a.m. And the next morning, the only evidence was a plethora of freshly broken off pine branches and a half-charred baby doll hanging from the rope where our food had been. Strange Storage by WDH662. The creepiest camping trip I've ever been on was with my best friend. We were in a semi-remote camping area, drivable usually to get to it, but definitely only by 4x4. It was a semi-maintained camping area, as in there were a couple of fire pits, a few rotten picnic tables, and a run-down outhouse. Parks check this place once a year, if that. So we got there and started setting up when my buddy wandered over to the shitter and opened the door. He stood there for a second or two and then closed the door, and then went to the second one, went in, and came out a few minutes later. He came back to me and said, "Hey, go check out that first one." I assumed someone shit on the floor or an animal got stuck in there and died or something. Nope. 3 full backpacks, and I'm talking big bags, like the bag I have, that size, I use for week-long trips. So we were being nosy. We opened them up. 2 were full of good quality gear, nothing unusual there. The third was full of Skittles. Bulk bags, small bags, regular size, tropical, sour, every flavor and size of bag you can imagine. The thing was just full of fucking Skittles. We camped there for 4 days and never saw a soul, and the bags were still there when we left. We let the COs know when we got to civilization. Who left all that gear? Why did one person pack 80 liters of Skittles? I don't know, but it was weird. Bad Neighbor by Anonymous. I lived in a very small town once where I worked from my laptop, like population 200 small. I was in a small cabin in the woods, lots of woods, though it was next to a highway. One day I was walking my dog and heard 2 gunshots somewhere nearby. I didn't think much of it. It was a hunting area and it was kind of redneck-like. The next day, or the day after, I don't remember, a truck pulled up. I didn't even know anyone in that town, so it was weird and I was put off. But the guy called me over and told me he was my neighbor and asked if I heard the shots. I said, yeah. He claimed it was his neighbor taking pot shots at his house over a land dispute. He didn't ask me to be a witness for him or anything, just asked if I heard. Okay, it seemed really odd to me. I'd never met that guy before, and when I say neighbor, I mean like 500 meters to a kilometer out of sight. The guy saw my dog digging somewhere unimportant, and all of a sudden he started trying to tell her to not do that. He got out of his truck and she was iffy of him, and he said, "Here, watch," and called her over. He grabbed her and tried to do the stupid fucking Cesar Chavez dominance thing, holding the dog on their back thing, for really no fucking reason. She started yelping, and I said, "Dude, stop." Then he asked me whether I had any guns myself, and I said no. He said he's a great dog trainer, and he asked me to go over and mow his lawn, and please ensure to bring your dog. In the strangest way, just like that. Please ensure you bring your dog. I can't describe it, but his mannerisms and the way he talked was just plain creepy, especially that line. He left soon after, and I began thinking, fuck, I just told this guy not only that I heard the gunshots, but that I'm unarmed. I mean, how did I even know it was his neighbor like he claimed, and not, in fact, that this weird dude has shot someone at his home and was trying to see who might have heard or witnessed it? I wasn't going to his house, not a fucking chance. It was a horrible feeling. But pretty soon he showed up asking why. He was calling and texting asking why. I gave him my number before realizing how weird he was. But he was really adamant that I go over to his house. Turns out the guy was a total alkie. Lost his wife, lost his job, lost everything, and was in a very dangerous mental state. He had nothing to lose. The small store owners in town explained the guy to me. He was apparently the most hated guy in the valley, with a very bad reputation. So at that point, I was really freaked out. I found it hard to sleep after that. I mean, I'm in a cabin in the woods, nobody nearby that would hear any commotion, ample angles for the place to be approached from the woods, and just a can of bear spray and a knife to protect me. And the guy knew that I didn't have any guns. And I'd be kept up for hours listening at night for any movement outside, as it was dead silent out there. Then, one night, in the middle of the night, my dog started to growl, and then growled even more. I didn't hear anything, but it didn't matter. Every room in that cabin had a window but the bathroom. I just got up, grabbed my knife and bear spray, and locked myself in that fucking bathroom for hours, just listening. I think I eventually fell asleep there. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dread. I just pictured this lunatic sneaking up with a shotgun to take me out for maybe having heard him murder someone with a gun days earlier. Fuck, man. It was just awful. I moved. But unfortunately my new landlords were equally creepy and even started trying to steal my dog, even though they had 3 of their own. I mean, literally, I heard them discussing it, how they had to make themselves the in crowd so that she'd want to be with them, and hand-feeding her dog food when they thought I wasn't looking. It must have just been the small town thing. Totally strange people in that town for the most part. They went to market one morning, and I packed up all my shit into my uninsured van with no license, got my dog in, and fucking bailed on that town, and never looked back. Deadly Watcher by Sandragon. My uncle built a house out on some acreage he has that is pretty far out in the woods. There isn't another house within 2 miles of his, at least. And again, most of it is woods and cow pastures. His place is beautiful. He built it all by hand and has a wonderful wraparound deck, perfect for family get-togethers. Well, one day we were all out there, probably 20 adults and 5 or 6 kids, for a party. It was one of those summer times when it was blazing hot, but the light breeze was cool enough that we didn't notice it after a while. I'd been there hanging out all day when in the evening I was asked to run into town and grab some more groceries. So I packed up and headed out, got the groceries, and everything was fine. As I drove back, it was getting darker, and it was at the time of year when dark comes fast, so it was pitch black out there when I finally arrived. As I pulled up, I noticed something was sitting in front of my car facing the house. It wasn't disturbed by my headlights, but it did glance back at me once. It was a fucking panther, just chilling there, watching the party. And as I sat there for a second watching it, I noticed that it had specifically placed itself near the edge where all the kids were running around. After I had my headlights on it for a minute or so, it kind of looked back at me again as if to say, "Okay, I was caught. Oh well." And then it gave the most human-sounding sigh and just walked off into the woods. I sat there for a bit before building myself up to get out of my car. Then I went into the party and told everyone what I had just seen. Twin Peaks and Mount Hood by Forsaken Hornet. About 3 years ago in September, my friend, I'll call her Agatha, and I drove up to the southwestern base of Mount Hood to view planets with her new telescope. We often go to national forests for stargazing or night hikes, and we're both experienced woodswomen. She's been a lifelong camper, and I'm a wilderness survival guide. We've both spent long periods of time in the wilderness, and both of us have had bear encounters, cougar encounters, wolves, elk, moose, you name it. I've also had my fair share of strange encounters with other people in those forests, from stumbling upon occult rituals to people living off-grid. But those are all stories on their own. All of this is to say that neither of us spook easily, and are very used to the diverse sights and sounds of the forest. Agatha had been to the spot we were heading to before. It's a dispersed campsite off a medium-use Forest Service road. We wanted to go to this particular spot because we knew it was high enough elevation that we'd lose a lot of light pollution, but not so high that we'd run into snow. It was a decent spot for stargazing with about a 150-foot diameter clearing that was mostly dirt and gravel. Though Agatha had been there before, I never had, and I wanted to drive a bit further up the mountain to see if we could find a slightly less treed view. So we drove another few minutes up the road. Along the way, I spotted a tent about 60 feet off the right side of the road at what looked like another dispersed campsite. The odd thing was, there wasn't a vehicle parked at the site, just the tent. Another odd thing was that it was pretty cold to be camping in a standard 2-3 season cabin-style tent. Night temperatures that time of year at that elevation are around 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that night it was about 36. When I pointed it out to Agatha, she slowed down a bit to check it out. I was concerned maybe someone had left the tent, and if so, we could take it down and dispose of it properly. So she slowed down to about 5 miles an hour, and I briefly shone a light toward the tent, but not directly on it in case someone was in there sleeping. In the 10 seconds or so it took for us to slowly drive by, it looked like maybe the tent wasn't fully zipped up, and I could see through the mesh door. It also looked like it was improperly assembled. We didn't think much more about it and kept driving. We said we'd check the tent out fully to determine if it was a dumped item on our way back down. We drove maybe another 1 or 2 minutes when the road narrowed severely as it curved on an incline. We're both used to sudden changes like that because Forest Service roads are known to be wily. But for whatever reason, Agatha came to a full stop before taking the curve and said, "I don't think we should go any further." I said, "Okay, well, why?" And she said, "I don't know, but I'm turning around and going to the spot we originally came here for." I was slightly concerned because she sounded a bit upset, but I chalked it up to her just being excited to finally use her new telescope. She reversed about 50 feet and turned the truck around to head back to the clearing. As we approached the spot where the tent was, I took off my headlamp and handed it to Agatha so she could shine it out her window on the left side of the road toward the tent. The weird thing is, it seemed like it had moved 30 or 50 feet down the road. It just didn't seem like it was in the same spot as before. Once we saw it to the left of the headlights, she came to a full stop on the road right in front of it. What was even creepier is that it now seemed to be closer to the road than it was before. But since I wasn't thinking too much about it the first time around, I just assumed it was one of those fallible eyewitness memory moments, and let it go. But I could only let that go for about 5 seconds. I don't know what came over Agatha, but she decided to shine the headlamp at full blast directly on the tent. I said, "Whoa, wait a minute, we still don't know if there might be someone sleeping in there." But as soon as I looked at the tent, I shut up. I stared at it for about 10 seconds before I said, "What the fuck are we looking at? Is that a tent?" Agatha said, "Yeah, I think so. It's just upside down." I blinked my eyes a bunch, thinking maybe the cold air had caused them to water and it was messing with my vision. I stared at it for another 5 seconds, and I don't know how else to explain this, but it looked like I was staring at a Picasso painting of a cabin-style tent. I mean, nothing was where it was supposed to be. I looked away for a few moments, thinking I should have brought my glasses, and I couldn't believe my night vision was suddenly so awful. At that point, I noticed a feeling of uneasiness creeping up on me, but I shrugged it off. I asked Agatha if she saw anyone in the tent. She took a few seconds to answer me and said, "Dude, to be perfectly honest, I don't know what the fuck I'm seeing. But yeah, I think I see someone's bare legs sticking up in the air." My heart went straight to my throat, and I immediately thought, oh no, someone is in fact inside, and they're either dead or dying of exposure. Agatha whispered, "What the fuck is that?" I looked toward the tent again, and for a split second, it almost looked like there were in fact someone's bare legs sticking up, as if they were on a cot in the dead bug position, with slightly bent knees. But this was through the mesh part of the tent door, so I couldn't make it out fully. I blinked my eyes again, because for whatever reason this damn tent was hard to look at, and when I opened my eyes in just that millisecond of blinking, the mesh door was closed, and the legs we thought we saw were gone. But the whole time it still looked like a Picasso painting, and I started to get a headache because it felt like my brain couldn't reconcile what I had seen, even though it was a seemingly ordinary object. It was just so disjointed and out of proportion, and seemed to shift every time I blinked. Agatha stared at it, mumbling, "What the fuck?" every few seconds, when she suddenly shook her head, rolled up the window, and said, "Let's just go. Someone is probably sleeping in it." I have no idea why she came to that conclusion or why I went along with it, aside from that it was the only reasonable explanation at the time. We'd both experienced out-of-the-ordinary things in the wilderness, so while this was definitely strange and caused us both to be on high alert, we didn't panic, and we rationalized the weirdness away. But of course, that didn't last long, because this night was determined to be strange. We left the tent behind and whoever may or may not have been sleeping in it, and we pulled into the gravel clearing about 5 minutes down the road. We both put on our headlamps and scoped the area for trash and critters. And the first odd thing to happen at this area is that while we were at the edge of that clearing, Agatha almost fell to the ground on her face. What's weird about that is the fact that she's an avid outdoorswoman, lots of experience walking at night on and off trails, with or without a light, and never having tripped or fallen before. But about a minute later, the same thing happened to me. As I walked from the edge of the clearing back to where we'd set up a tarp and blanket, I tripped and almost fell backwards. This happened to both of us about a half a dozen times more, tripping over nothing, even tripping over our own feet. It almost felt like the ground wasn't where it was supposed to be. Rationally, I could say everyone has off days, and in my case I hadn't been there before. But Agatha had, and she was familiar with the area. Plus, I routinely visit new places many times, and I don't recall ever tripping and stumbling like that outside of treacherous terrain or creek walking. I don't know. Make of that what you will. We brushed off the weirdness, and Agatha got about setting up her telescope. I lay down on the tarp while she tried to get Jupiter in view, and she spent maybe 3 minutes setting up the telescope and about 30 minutes trying to lock it on Jupiter. Every time she got it lined up in the scope and took a moment to stand up straight, maybe 3 to 5 seconds, she'd bend down to the eyepiece again, and Jupiter would be gone. That whole time I was laying on the ground on a tarp with a crocheted blanket draped over me, perfectly comfortable. I didn't notice just how comfortable I was until she asked me to come over and look through the scope to see if I could keep Jupiter in sight. As soon as I stood up, I noticed a temperature change from when I had been lying down. It was suddenly way colder. Not like a wave of cold air. The air was still. It was like the temperature on the ground was 15 or 20 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. I also couldn't keep a beat on Jupiter, and after another 5 minutes of trying, we gave up and laid down on the tarp for some stargazing. After chilling out for a few minutes in silence, I realized that Agatha didn't have a blanket, so I asked her if she'd like to share mine. She said, "No thanks, I'm not cold." That was odd because she is one of those people who is always cold, so for her to decline a blanket was just another check for the list of anomalies of the night. I mentioned that to her, and I also noticed a change in temperature from about 10 to 12 inches off the ground. I wish I had thought to put my hand directly on the ground to feel if it was cold or not, but at the time none of this was registering as a red flag or something to pay much heed to. As I was staring up at the sky, which was perfectly clear, I noticed that it was split in two, running east to west. The best way I could describe it is that there was an invisible line demarcating half of the sky into a northern and southern section. The northern side was somehow lighter than the southern side. It almost looked like the north side was affected by light pollution, whereas the south was not. But it got even stranger. As soon as I noticed the split sky phenomenon, I also noticed the stars on either side were twinkling at different rates. As soon as I noticed the stars, the split reversed. The south was now lighter, and the north darker. I pointed it out to Agatha. She watched for a while and confirmed she had seen the same thing happen. We chalked it up to some unknown natural phenomenon, and I've yet to get a solid answer of how that happened. It wasn't a light pollution dome or a light dome of any kind, because this demarcation was stark, not at all diffused or fuzzy. The sun had set at least an hour and a half earlier, so it wasn't a twilight wedge either. It also couldn't have been due to anti-crepuscular rays, because we were facing west. I would love for a meteorologist to weigh in on this. Another 10 minutes passed, and I was so comfortable I felt like I could fall asleep. In fact, I was starting to close my eyes when Agatha suddenly sat up and shook me. She said she saw a light coming from approximately where the Picasso tent was, through the tree line to the southwest. I didn't bother sitting up. I just turned my head to look in that direction. I asked if she thought it was a flashlight, and she said maybe, but it seemed to be too high off the ground. I said it probably was the person who was staying in that tent, and maybe they just got back from a night hike or were going to the bathroom. She agreed and laid back on the tarp again. Time passed, and I lost track of the minutes as I was starting to doze again, but I guess it was anywhere from another 10 to 20 minutes. I was perfectly comfortable, lulled into a light sleep, and maybe even a mild hypnagogic state, when I suddenly sat bolt upright. Agatha was still laying down and appeared to have fallen asleep. There was no noise, nothing discernible woke me up. I looked toward the tree line to the southwest and saw a light. For a split second I was congratulating myself for having such sharp senses that I could tell when someone was walking with a flashlight that far away. But that faded quickly when I noticed another light. And another. I had one of those moments where my mind couldn't piece together what I was seeing and couldn't match it to anything I had seen before. There were a total of 3 lights, or orbs. I wasn't seeing beams of light emitting from a flashlight. I was seeing orbs of light floating independently through the upper half of the tree canopy toward us. They were maintaining a triangular formation, but were rotating around one another. They had a bluish hue, kind of like a cheap LED sun lamp. I couldn't say for certain how large they were because I had no frame of reference aside from the tree line, which was about 50 feet away from where I was sitting. But the orbs were not directly at the edge of the clearing. They seemed to be much farther away, and I could tell they were coming towards us as they appeared to be getting slightly larger as I stared at them. I shook Agatha and pointed toward the tree line. She turned her head in that direction and shot up to her feet. She grabbed her telescope, and I stood up and wadded up the tarp and blanket, and we threw everything in the bed of her truck without putting the telescope back in its case or anything. And then we got in. and floored it out of there. I have never felt the kind of dread that I felt on the mountainside that night. I was in full fight or flight mode to such a high degree I felt like I wanted to run while I was in the truck. The panic was so awful that my breathing was erratic and my hands went numb for a few minutes. We didn't speak until we got fully out of the forest and onto Highway 26. Once we saw another car passing in the opposite direction, we both sighed with relief and started in with a bunch of what the fucks. To this day, I don't have any answers. It was such a bizarre mishmash of innocuous occurrences. Each thing on its own was barely strange, but I can't help to think that the temperature change, the ground being wonky, the Picasso tent, and the split sky were somehow related to seeing those orbs. Then again, it's the brain's job to try to make sense of everything, even when there's nothing to make sense of. Our panicked reaction and shared sense of dread was also very strange and out of character for both of us. It was a sudden, visceral reaction, and it felt like there had to be something else at play to make us both react that way. Hopefully, someone has some insight on potential rational explanations. Otherwise, I guess it's aliens. Nature is Scarier Than Anything by Anonymous. I used to go backpacking all the time in the mountains and have some good stories, but hands down the scariest thing I've ever encountered is lightning. My first real experience with it was at Philmont in New Mexico. Great backpacking area and lots of fun if you're a scout. Not fun when it storms. My group was eating dinner one night when lightning struck a tree about 50 feet from us. It was unexpected. There were dark clouds, but the sun was shining through still. But this thing just shredded the tree and all of us jumped. Dinner ended up in the dirt. We did have a couple of other close experiences during those 2 weeks, but that was the closest. The second and most terrifying experience I've had was when we were in Kings Canyon, California, doing the Ray Lakes Trail. One of the campsites was by a river, and now it's prone to rain in the Sierra Nevadas, and we were all at the bottom of a tight granite valley that showed some signs of historical flooding. It was not my ideal choice of a spot to sleep, but it was an NPS site, and it was at the end of our day. At about 2 a.m., I was awoken by a flash of light so bright I swear I could see the tent through my eyelids. Before I could even think, the thunder roared so loudly I thought the earth was tearing itself apart. It's hard to accurately describe the sheer power and sound that comes from being right next to a lightning strike. And the night didn't end there either. We were directly under the storm and the lightning just kept coming. The thunder never ceased to roll, and the rain was torrential. The lightning was so constant as well, you could almost see through the walls of the tent into the forest around us. It was like daylight out there. I thought I was going to die that night, either from a lightning strike or a flood if the river rose. The third experience was in Switzerland. We were up in the Alps and got caught in an open field and rocky area during a descent as a storm rolled in. Again, lightning strikes far too close for comfort and no place to shelter. We were just squatting down and praying that we wouldn't get struck. I mean, an amazing trip, but that moment was not enjoyable. I love watching lightning and rain from inside a cabin or covered porch now, but if I'm outside and a storm is coming, I've gotten this almost animalistic fear that screams at me to get indoors. Lightning scares the living shit out of me if I'm not covered. Human Predators by Lazy Couch Days. When I was a kid around 8 or 9, my mom, grandma, brothers, and I went camping at a small camp about 2 hours from the town we lived in. We went there a lot and even had a particular campsite we had slowly built up over the years. On this trip, we had my aunt and uncle's dogs with us since they were doing military tours. They were both well-trained bird dogs, but usually really calm and friendly. The first night on the trip, Star started growling in the tent at about 1 in the morning. My mom thought something was outside and investigated the dogs. As she got out of the tent, Star and Ariel would not let her move to the other edge of the campsite, and both went into an attack position while herding my mom towards the car. That's also while keeping themselves in front of the tent. By that point, we were all up, and with a group of kids under 10, all freaking out. For a reason she can't explain to this day, my mother packed up camp and got us all into the car to head home. After about 10 minutes out of the campsite, a car started following us, and the dogs crawled their way into the back and just started growling again. By that point, everyone was in borderline panic mode, and my brothers were crying the entire car ride home. As our town came into view, we had to cross a huge bridge to drive in, and the car was still following us. As a kid, you make stories to yourself that nothing's wrong and that the car behind you is just full of scared people too. Yet as we started across the bridge, the car stopped, turned around, and went speeding back the way we came. We stopped at a gas station, and everyone was near meltdown mode, and my mom went in to get cigarettes. But Star would not let her back into the car until she could see my mom clearly. That, and a camping trip a few years later, convinced me camping is no longer my thing. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you like what you've heard and seen and you're catching this on YouTube, give the video a thumbs up. Leave a comment. I'd like to know what you thought of the stories, and if you're not a subscriber, hey, why not subscribe? Tell a friend about the channel. All that stuff does help out with the algorithms. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take a step further in supporting what I'm doing, find a link in the description to my Patreon page, and consider getting yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is in the description as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.